Welcome to the Carl Jackson Show. We've got a bang-up show for you today. Eric Lindrum, he's a columnist for AM Greatness. He's going to be joining us today, also co-host of the Right Take podcast, and he's going to be on to talk about Generation Z and the millennial generation and what issues are going to appeal to them leading up to 2024, because he thinks the Republican Party has gotten it all wrong. It is not about the economy, stupid. We've had governors like Governor Glenn Youngkin and also governors like Ron DeSantis who have played up the cultural issues in midterm elections that have fared well for the Republican Party. He believes this is the way the Republican Party needs to go right now because we had abysmal results in 2020, 2022, and even special elections in 2023. And so we want to win in 2024. Also, we're going to talk about Taylor Swift and the Super Bowl, conspiracy theories, and what is the ATF up to? All of that and more coming up on The Carl Jackson Show. All right, welcome to the Carl Jackson Show. This is your weekly dose of objective truth in a world of confusion and lies. Guys, there's so much going on in American politics. It is absolutely insane. But obviously, we are rushing toward the 2024 election, the general election. It seems to me that Trump will be the nominee. There's things that I suspect Nikki Haley is trying to do. I don't believe they'll work, but what I do want to talk to you about is what we'll need to focus on, or some of the issues we may need to focus on to win in the general election. And I'm joined by my guest, Eric Lindrum. He's with AM Greatness. He also hosts the Right Take podcast. So he's written a fabulous column. Actually, he wrote one last year, the same topic, but the title of it, it's still not the economy, stupid. And I want to get into what he's talking about because I think Republicans, conservatives, libertarians need to take heed to what Eric Lindrum is saying in this column. So, Eric, welcome back to the Carl Jackson Show.
Carl, thank you so much for having me back on. It's always a pleasure. And it has been a while, hasn't it?
Yes, it has been a while, but Eric, listen, guys, follow Eric on AM Greatness. Literally, I think he writes about 1,000 columns a day. It is insane. Pop on AM Greatness, and it's Eric Lindrum, Eric Lindrum, Eric Lindrum, Victor Davis Hanson, Deborah Hine, Eric Lindrum. It's insane. But anyway, he does a lot of work, so check it out there. He's always writing fabulous stuff. Some stuff is just to keep you up to date on the latest news, and then you get nuggets like this column that we're talking about here. And guys, I want to win the 2024 election, and I want to make sure that we're focused. Frankly, even if Trump does win, I don't think 4 years is enough, frankly, to turn this country around. I think there's got to be a cultural shift, spiritual shift, obviously a political shift. But the first thing we do have to do is focus on winning 2024. And that's where I feel Eric Lindrum column comes in. So, Eric, let's start. Let's talk about this. Let me just read a little bit from it because you outlined several points that need to be made, or subtopics, if you will, in this column. When an outlier becomes a trend, I want to go through that, what really matters, and we'll just break these down point by point, if you don't mind, Eric. A new generation of hearts and minds. And so these are all the things that Eric is arguing that you're going to need, or Republican voters are going to need to focus on or recognize in order for us to start winning elections. All right, so you talk about when an outlier becomes a trend. You say, and I want to get your response to this. Obviously, I'm reading your work. For the last several decades, since the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency, the GOP has always preferred to promote one issue and one issue alone: fiscal conservatism. From lower taxes and reduced regulations to cutting government spending, the Republican Party loves to talk about the free market and often little else. Man, isn't that the truth? The strategy has stemmed from the infamous line used by Democratic strategist James Carville during the 92 campaign that saw Bill Clinton defeat George H.W. Bush and Ross Perot. Quote, "It's the economy, stupid." And this was based partially on the famous question that Reagan asked at the end of his only debate with Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election. Quote, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" Close quote. That doesn't work anymore, you say, Eric. Why not?
So, like many other political norms that have just been thrown out the window with the arrival of Donald Trump on the scene, the idea that the economy is the base issue that voters will ultimately decide an election on it's just not so anymore. The general wisdom has always been, if the economy is great, we'll reward the party in power and keep them in power. If the economy is bad, we'll chuck the bums out and vote in the other party. But there have been a few trends recently in recent elections, the last 3 recent elections, that show increasingly the economy does not matter anymore. This is all proven history at this point. The most recent example, of course, being the 2022 midterms. Last time you had me on, Carl, we talked about a previous article I had written back in August of 2022 warning the GOP is going to blow the midterms. And to quote one of my favorite movies of all time, I hate being right all the time. It ended up being true, and they did blow it. Why did they blow it? Because they spent those last few months of the midterm election talking nonstop about inflation, gas prices, and other economic woes. And what was the final result? It was a wash. Yeah, we barely took the House, but we lost a Senate seat. It was not the red wave we were hoping for. Let's go even further back, because some people will try to say, oh, well, 2022 was an anomaly. Some will say the Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision is the reason for that. Let's go further back. This is one number from the 2020 election a lot of people seem to have forgotten. It's been swept under the rug. So, of course, Reagan famously asked that question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago in 1980? And subsequently, in every election since then, Gallup, the premier pollster in the country, would ask that same question right before the election, since 84 onward. Now, in 2020, they asked the question again. In September of 2020, they polled this question, mind you. So this is well into the COVID lockdowns, well after all the destruction of the race riots in the summer. And how many said yes? 56%. A record high, 56% of Americans said, yes, we are better off now under Trump than we were 4 years ago. That smashed the previous record high of 47% who said yes in 2004, right before Bush Jr. was narrowly reelected. And yet somehow Biden still, quote unquote, air quotes, won the election. Now, even if we take into account the fraud, which most likely stole it, you can still likely infer that Biden did win the popular vote just as Hillary did in 2016. Yeah, he probably got about maybe 49%. So you take that 56%, roughly 7 or 8% of that total said, yeah, the economy is better under Trump. We are better under Trump. But I'm still going to vote for the other guy. Why on earth would they do that? Why would they vote against their economic interests? And then lastly, we go further back to 2018. A colleague of mine at American Greatness named Christopher Gage wrote a similar article titled, It's Not the Economy, Stupid. This was back in 2018, so we're talking 6 years ago, folks, where he talked about how this is the immediate aftermath of the 2018 midterms. Despite Paul Ryan's attempts to promote a great economy, Republicans, the GOP, the economy is so great because it was at its peak. This is post-2016. Trump was in office, but pre-coronavirus. The economy was roaring and booming like never before in modern times. And they still threw the Republicans out in a landslide. Pelosi came back. They took the House. We managed to keep the Senate, but it was still a blowout for the Democratic Party. So we're basically entering a new era here where people are more prepared to vote not based on the economy, not based on their pocketbook, but on emotions, whether it's anger or fear. And these are things, we've talked about this before, Carl, the Democrats excel at. They beat the Republicans on messaging every time on scaring their voters into not supporting the Republican Party, a good economy or bad economy notwithstanding.
Let me ask you this, and again, I'm speaking with my guest, Eric Lindrum. He is a columnist at AM Greatness, and you can also check out his podcast, Right Take Podcast. All right, so if it's not the economy, stupid, is there a tipping point where people? You can't help but to go to the grocery store now, look at the prices, the gas prices. It's harder to find a place to rent. Mortgages are sky high. Do you believe there's going to be a tipping point where even younger voters say, "Wait a minute, things are a little too crazy," or is it still completely emotional? Whereas these emotional arguments, in a sense, and I believe it's because of this, Eric. I believe that even the Republican Party and the conservative movement, in my opinion, has become more secular. So I think that alone makes it harder to win elections. But that's my take. I don't think there's much objective truth swinging around. But is there a turning point, or in your opinion, or is it no way, no how? These voters, on the younger voters, Generation Z, and we'll get into this a little more later, millennials, they're just too emotional, and Democrats know how to pull at their heartstrings.
At this point, Carl, sadly, no, I don't think there is a tipping point. You got to remember, right up to the 2022 midterms, it had reached an all-time high. Inflation was already bad in 2021, and that was kind of what contributed to the beginning of Biden's downfall in the polling numbers. But gas prices were at an all-time high, grocery prices, everything. It was really bad come November 2022, and it was still a wash. Now, again, whether that was Dobbs, whether that was just the rise of, which I don't think it was Dobbs, I do think it was the rise of younger voters, and we will come back to that, as you said. That's later in the article. But I think, basically, to summarize this up, if we're talking about the voters that matter, right, and I'm going to tie this to, of course, I always cite the example of Glenn Youngkin and the Virginia election. Yep. That was not an election we were supposed to win, but we did win. He spent most of the campaign up until the last 3 weeks or so talking about that stuff, the inflation, the economy, taxes, regulations, blah, blah, blah. Then in the last 3 weeks, he shifted to the cultural stuff. And who did that ultimately get on his side? That got on his side a lot of Northern Virginians and that cursed demographic we always hear about, white suburban voters, the white suburban housewives, the soccer moms, what have you. Because ultimately those voters who voted for Biden and then 1 year later turned around and voted for Youngkin, they're generally upper middle class. They're pretty well off financially. Their income's probably around six figures a year, give or take. They can handle a little uptick in groceries and gas prices and whatnot. Now, it's a different story, of course, for the working class, the rural voters who already overwhelmingly support Republicans. But these voters don't care as much, with a slight increase in maybe their kids' tuition or whatnot. So, yeah, if we're talking about the voters we need to reach in order to win an election for once, wouldn't that be nice? It feels like it's been so long since we last won an election. It's gonna have to be something else other than the economy.
Okay, so we have just about 40 seconds left in this block, Eric. Let me ask you this. I believe there was an example of Glenn Youngkin even before Glenn Youngkin, and I believe that exists in the state of Florida. I believe in part that is why Ron DeSantis won such a landslide reelection in his gubernatorial race. He touched on a lot of these issues, and to my surprise, even frankly, a lot of black Democratic women ended up voting for Ron DeSantis because he was hitting on a lot of these issues, including education, but for some reason he could not translate well into national elections. 20 seconds to respond.
Absolutely. I do agree with that. In the primaries in 2022, we saw at the same time in Florida, conservatives had massive victories in school board elections across the state. And on the other side of the East Coast, the same day in the primaries in New York, we saw Republicans throw away a winnable election.
We'll leave it there. We'll be back. More with Eric Lindrum from AM Great. Welcome back to the Carl Jackson Show. And again, I'm joined by my guest, Eric Lindrum. He is a columnist for AM Greatness. Also, you can check out his podcast, the Right Take Podcast. Eric, where can people find you online?
As you said, at American Greatness, amgreatness.com. You can always find my articles in the news section and occasionally the commentary section as well. And you can follow me on X at The Right Take Pod, at The Right Take Pod on X.
Okay. All right. The Right Take Pod. Okay. Now, Eric, he trips me out because he's such a young guy. And then I read a lot of his stuff and I'm like, good God, this kid knows a lot of stuff. He's not a kid. I don't mean he writes fantastic stuff. He's a great thinker. So I have to give him props. And I think he's one of those voices that I think we need to listen to heading into these elections, because obviously, listen, I'm an old buck, if you will, and so he's probably going to have a better pulse on the younger generation for sure than I am. I barely know how to spell the word podcast, so this is where we are. All right, so. Basically, he's been arguing the point, and I encourage you to read the column for yourself. It's still not the economy, stupid. If you Google that or go back to AM Greatness and search their website, you'll be able to find it. And again, his name is Eric Lindrum. All right, so basically, listen, the old adage that it's the economy, stupid, doesn't seem to be working anymore. We saw that in 2020. We saw that in 2022. And I know there's an asterisk next to 2020. I get it, but I think Eric is right. I still think Biden won the popular vote. More than likely, just because Democrats come out and vote. They did a lot of ballot harvesting. I'm not convinced that Biden won the election fair and square, but that's a topic for another day. But having said that, Democrats did surprisingly well. That is the bottom line. They did well and better in 2020 than we expected, better in 2022 than we expected, better in the elections, the special elections in 2023 than I expected, Eric. And frankly, locally, we just lost what should have been an easily winnable race right here, not in my district. I'm right outside of the district. A local state house representative race barely got much attention, but Democrats end up taking a seat from a Republican that we thought was a shoo-in, and it simply did not happen. So this idea that we're going to run on, first off, the world has gone insane. The Democrat Party is insane. They're a bunch of communists, in my opinion. So Eric is making the case that, listen, the Democrats are running on emotional issues, and Republicans better get there. Otherwise, we're going to lose. Did I sum that up okay, Eric?
Absolutely. That basically the argument. And here's the bone I'm going to throw to people, because I've shown this article to plenty of friends of mine, sensible fellow right-wing friends who I agree with otherwise, who say, no, that's ridiculous. The economy is still all that matters. Here's the bone I'm going to throw to them. I'm not saying completely ignore the current economic issues. But at the end of the day, any and all voters who are going to vote based on their pocketbook, seeing how much lighter their wallet is, their grocery bills, their gas prices, whatever, at the end of the day, they will come out and vote for Republicans, i.e. President Trump, no matter what. They do not need extra prodding. They do not need these extra tens of millions in messaging from the GOP on, hey, did you see the latest GDP report? They will vote Republican regardless. Trying to go after these voters anyway, as the GOP is right now and always has been, is what's known as committing the mistake of selling past the close. When you're making we're trying to sell someone on this car, for example, and they agree to buy the car and they sign on the dotted line, and the salesman continues talking about how great the car is, trying to pitch them on the car when they've already bought it. At that point, you're doing damage. You're going to make them maybe rethink it, and you're wasting time and energy. What you should be doing is going for voters who otherwise would not vote for you. And again, I refer back to the Glenn Youngkin strategy. He shored up the Trump base just fine. He accepted Trump's endorsement. He did not disavow Trump or distance himself from Trump. But in the end, he got a bunch of, upper middle class, white suburban voters, former Biden voters in the Northern Virginia suburbs to vote for him. How did he do that? In the last 3 weeks, the messaging shifted to the culture war, to transgenderism, CRT, under the general umbrella of education and parents' rights in education. What the GOP needs to do, and I've been saying this ever since 2021, that he had gifted them on a gold platter a bulletproof strategy. The GOP should just go to these voters and say, hey, forget the economy. Do you support a party that believes it's okay for men to put on skirts and then go into women's restrooms, women's locker rooms in schools, and possibly rape your daughters? Oh, and by the way, the schools will then side with the rapists and call your daughter a transphobe? If you do, then by all means, vote for Democrats. Do you support state-mandated public curriculum that teaches your white children that they are evil because of systemic racism and they should hate themselves and be ashamed of their ancestry and they'll be ostracized by their teachers and classmates? If you support that, by all means, vote for the Democratic Party. But if you don't like the way that sounds, we've got an alternative for you right over here. His name is Donald Trump. And those voters will run screaming into the arms of the Republican Party. We saw it in Virginia. We need to do it again because we've seen it again. When the GOP switches to default factory settings, economy, GDP, national debt, guess what? They lose.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. I mean, I look at the culture wars that are happening right now, from the trans movement to, again, just as you mentioned, listen, if you're white, you're an oppressor. If you're black, you're automatically oppressed. And I just sit there and think, man, I don't know why the GOP are so weak when it comes to this issue. And the only thing that makes sense to me, Eric, is because the GOP has gone too secular and they look at these issues and they're like, there's no way we can win. But I think you can win because I think people inherently know the Ten Commandments. That's my opinion. So when you start bringing up real issues of injustice and racism, your kid is racist just because he's born white and stuff like that, that's going to touch people. Do you want to inherit an America where your kid is known as the racist, where your kid is called a racist? I mean, it's just an unfair society. And it's amazing to me. Do you want to grow up in a society or have your kid grow up in a society where, let's say, he or she excels at athletics, and yet some dude like this track dude that just won what was it, a collegiate record, I believe it was, beating out a couple of women, and I'm looking at the guy run and I'm like, man, what big legs that chick has. I mean, it's insane. I don't understand why we don't go after this stuff.
It really is. The GOP largely doesn't understand it. And I think there is a point to be made. A friend of mine brought this up, that there's a lot of Americans out there. So we may not know that. We are deep into politics, guys like you and I. But a lot of Americans still just don't get transgenderism. They don't understand it. They mostly just see the pop culture and see, oh, I guess it's a new sexual thing. I'll let them be what they want to be, whatever. I guarantee you, if you got every single American, every registered voter into a room, sat them down, and explained transgenderism to them, no bias left or right, no talking points, just say, here's what a surgery is, here's what goes into it, maybe show them some pictures of the results. I have seen some of the uncensored pictures. It's horrifying. You then show them the studies, the fact that the suicide rates do not change after getting the surgeries. The rate of regret actually goes up. You hear testimonies from people who have detransitioned who regret it. If you gave every single American an explainer on this and showed them real-world proof and real-world studies, Trump would win like 70% of the popular vote. I guarantee it, because then you force the Democrats into a no-win situation, as you do with many of their far-left positions. You force the Democrats to answer for this. And do you support this mass mutilation and raping and grooming of little kids? They either say yes, they double down to support it, and they lose all these moderates, or they take the sensible stand and oppose it, then they lose the far left base. That's what we're seeing with Biden right now. A huge reason why Biden's poll numbers are going down, and the GOP needs to understand this. It's not the economy, stupid. It's because he's losing his own base right now. And not because the economy's bad for young people, because they think he's not radical enough. He's losing young people because they think he's not radical enough on global warming or student loan debt. He's losing Muslim Americans because they think he's not anti-Israel enough. And that could be ultimately the reason why Trump ultimately wins, is because Biden has lost his own base of support. Because this big multicultural coalition the left has built is a house of cards just waiting to be blown over at the slightest gust.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think Democrats walk a dangerous line. They get all of these groups that fit on their intersectional platform, if you will, and if one of them leaves, the Democrats are absolutely in trouble. Let's go to another one of your subtopics here. You say a new generation of hearts and minds. We only have a minute left in this segment, but I just want to read a little bit of it. We'll get you primed here, and then we'll come back and address this. You say part of this new phenomenon can be attributed to the rise of social media and the sensationalizing of politics, which was due in large part to Trump himself and his historic candidacy in 2016, which brought in millions of new voters who had either never voted before or had not voted in decades due to a sense of disillusionment with the system. But another reason is the rising generation that will soon become the dominant age demographics in America. 40 seconds to respond to that. We'll have to backtrack on the other side, but I wanted to get you started.
So basically, as it relates to the economy and why it's not the economy anymore, millennials and Zoomers have, as Gen Z is known, they have a completely different lived experience when it comes to the economy compared to older generations, because all they have ever known in their lives is a bad economy, folks. Just like all they've ever known when it comes to foreign policy in the aftermath of 9/11 is a country that is always at war.
Man, all right, bringing the pain. Eric Lindrum from AM Greatness. That is such a good point, and we'll follow up on this point after the break. You're listening to the Carl Jackson Show on SNC TV and the Salem Podcast Network. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Carl Jackson Show. I'm your host, Carl Jackson, in on SNC TV. We appreciate you joining us. Also, check out my show on the podcast network, Salem Podcast Network, or wherever you go to get your podcast. You can follow me on all things social media at The Carl Jackson Show. I'm on X, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, True Social Getter, wherever I am on social media. At The Carl Jackson Show is where you can find me. I'm joined by my guest, Eric Lindrum. Eric, will you please, again, remind the people where they can go to find you?
Again, you can find all my writings at American Greatness at amgreatness.com, amgreatness.com. And I post most frequently, more than anyone else, on X, the platform, the artist formerly known as Twitter, at The Right Take Pod. You can get all my hottest takes there on a very regular basis, at The Right Take Pod on X.
Okay. All right. Perfect. And so I read a lot of Eric's stuff, a lot of his columns. I mean, he has a great mind. He's a young conservative. I think he knows the pulse of the millennial and Generation Z. And actually, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the issues that right now, we're talking about the issues that are going to impact them. And Eric wrote a great column. This is what we're sifting through. It's still not the economy, stupid. And he wrote a column basically, I think it was headed into the 2022 midterms, Eric?
The one you're thinking of, yeah, that was August of 2022, which was, yes,
Okay.
Republicans are blowing the midterms.
Okay, all right, yeah. And I remember reading that column, and I'm like, this guy hit it right on the money. And I was like, is there anyone else in the conservative movement thinking this way? And I mean, the red wave was coming, I thought. But and then as I read that column and I just started looking around, I didn't see the excitement that I thought I would see. But I still thought we would win in great numbers. And then it was such a letdown. It was just absolutely insane. But he got it right early on in 2022. And so we have him back because obviously we're looking, it's not a midterm, we're looking at a general election. And right now, Biden is not popular, but conservatives aren't necessarily popular either. And so we need to touch on the issues that are going to, where we're going to gain more voters. And that's what we're working on. That's what we're talking about. So Generation Z and the millennials, Eric, they're not swayed by the economy as much. You made a fabulous point that they've always, their entire lives, they've lived in an America where the economy hasn't been that great, with the exception of living under Donald Trump. I mean, in George Bush's, I think it maybe his first term or something, it was pretty good, but they spent like drunken sailors, and then by the midterms in his second term, they just got obliterated by the Democrats. But you make a great point there. These people are used to living, if you will, or these voters, in an economy that isn't so great. So it's not necessarily the motivating factor when they're headed to the polls.
Exactly. Again, we talked about this the last time you had me on, Carl, that this is what comes down to generational differences, and as a result, an important phrase that we need to understand and not let the left hijack it with their conceptions of, relativism and whatnot. The idea of lived experiences. That just as with foreign policy, and we're seeing this now more than ever, the world is on fire thanks to Biden. But most millennials and pretty much all Zoomers grew up in the shadow of 9/11. So all they have ever known is a country at war, from Afghanistan in 2001 all the way to 20 years later. And a brief reprieve following that disastrous withdrawal. But now here we are. We're involved with Ukraine. Now we're involved with Israel. We got getting ready for something in Yemen, I guess. And then we had this attack in Jordan by Iran. And Taiwan is still on the horizon. Like, goodness gracious, what's going on? So all they have ever known is a country of war. So younger voters are already generally anti-war as part of the culture. But more than ever, they are opposed to what they have always known as a pro-war country. The same is true with the economy. That all that they remember is an economy that has been bad ever since the crash under George Bush Jr. in 2007. And then, yeah, like you said, the economy got better than ever before. It kind of slugged along, it limped along under Obama. Then it got better than ever before under Trump, until the coronavirus came along and basically set us right back to square one. And unfortunately, both of these crises happened under Republicans. Now, obviously, that's not Trump's fault, and you can make the argument whether or not that was Bush Jr.'s fault, but at the end of the day, if it happens on their watch, they'll be blamed for it. That's what happened to Herbert Hoover in 1929, the crash that led to the Great Depression. He got swept out of office in 1932 in one of the biggest landslides in American history. So when Republicans go to these younger voters, assuming they are trying to go to these younger voters, and they say, oh, the economy is really terrible, vote for us and we'll make it better. Most young voters, millennials and Zoomers, are going to scratch their heads and be like, what are you talking about? The economy's always been bad. We're with it at this point. We're used to it. They don't know anything different. Like when they try to say, oh, the world is at war, everything's crazy with all these wars. Like, you guys have always supported wars too. It was Republicans who started these wars, under Bush. So it does not matter. It makes no difference to them because that is just a generational divide that you're never going to bridge that gap. No amount of history lessons is going to change what they know based on their lived experiences as younger voters.
Man, such a fascinating point. Let me go back to the issue of war because that just fascinates me. I had not thought about it in that way. That a lot of the Generation Z and the millennials, I mean, they've just grown up in an era, obviously, where you're right. We've been in war for so long that it's absolutely insane. It is all they've known. So again, is it a matter of, listen, we're kind of despondent when it comes to the issue of war, or we're tired of it? What did you see more?
Definitely, that is the best point, is that Charlie Kirk made this point on X. We are, quote, war-weary millennials. We are sick and tired of nonstop war. And I always point to this. This blows my mind. I'm sure it'll blow your mind too, Carl. There was a brief period before the end of the Afghanistan war when there were Zoomers in the armed services, at the age of 18, I believe, is the minimum age for recruitment, there were some Zoomers in the armed services who were not even around, who had not even been born until after 9/11 happened. They were serving in a war that started before they were born. If ever there is really a war crime, that should be a war crime, being in a war for that long. Any country, no matter what the reason, the long extension of that war. And again, we're seeing it now with Ukraine. Like, we're giving aid to Ukraine even though they are not a NATO ally. We, of course, Israel is an ally, so it's understandable why we're supporting them, but you're seeing all these young voters who are just anti-Israel because that's the trend. And now Yemen, maybe something in Taiwan, who knows? All they've ever known is a warmongering country that makes Vietnam look like child's play, right? And they're sick and tired of it.
Wow, man, it's just a fascinating point. This is why you need the younger generation up and coming, because this idea of a lived experience. You're absolutely right. I mean, as someone that's slightly older, I'm slightly out of the millennial generation. I can remember times when there weren't war. I can remember, the pre 9/11 era. I can remember an America that, in my opinion, was overdone in past racism until Barack Obama got elected, and he reinstituted that into the American psyche and into the American culture. In my opinion, I'm curious about that, Eric. When it comes to the younger generation, how do they view race relations? How do they see race in America? I recently read a poll that before Obama's presidency, 70% of Americans believe that race relations were good in America. After his presidency, we were down to 44%. What are you seeing with the younger generations?
I think, unfortunately, the conditioning has worked. The mass indoctrination of CRT, DEI, all these programs, affirmative action until it was recently overturned. It has done its job. Millennials are all in on it, and I think most Zoomers are all in on it. Although there are some studies showing there is a bit of a divide growing in the Zoomer generation based not necessarily on race, but on gender. That Zoomer men are more likely to be conservative, and Zoomer women, of course, are more likely to be liberal. So maybe there's something we can work with there. But yeah, Republicans, I get the sense that for the longest time, Republicans have been terrified to discuss race. They run away from it, and they'd rather, again, default factory settings like the economy. They'd rather not talk about race, whereas the Democrats do nothing but talk about it. So Republicans need to be prepared to even have that conversation if they're going to have a chance at even beginning to maybe win them over. And again, I don't know. I think once millennials and Zoomers are the dominant age demographic, it may already be too late for this country. I don't know. But Republicans cannot win if they don't show up to the fight.
Man, such a good point. We only have a minute and a half left. Let me get your take on free speech as it relates to Generation Z and the the millennial generation, because I'm looking at, everybody is on their iPhones. Privacy doesn't seem to matter to people anymore. Is there any growing desire to see privacy again, to see free speech rights restored amongst the younger generation? I'm praying so.
I don't think so. I think, because lived experiences, generational differences, millennials and Zoomers have grown up very privileged, even though they wouldn't know it. They would talk about oppression and whatnot. They've grown up knowing a country that is, when it comes to civil rights, the constitutional rights, we're pretty good for the most part up until these last few years with Biden. So, and especially, with TikTok, they're all on TikTok. They don't care that it's owned by China. They don't care that it's stealing all their private information. They're doing it because that's what all their friends are doing. It's a social thing. It's about a trend and fitting in with your friends. And right now, it is the big trendy thing to favor security over freedom. The famous warning that I believe it was Jefferson who warned, he who prefers security over freedom deserves neither. So I don't see that tide changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
But the other cultural issues, 15 seconds, you believe will work. The trans issues, oppression, so on, et cetera.
Yes, if we finally just start talking about them and forget the economy and start talking about transgenderism, CRT, the cultural issues that won Virginia in 2021 and that Donald Trump has used effectively, then yes, the GOP can finally win again.
All right, Eric Lindrum, AM Greatness, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Carl.
All right, welcome back to the Carl Jackson Show. Again, we're joined by my guest, Eric Lindrum. He's a columnist for AM Greatness, and you can also find him on X at The Right Take Pod. Is that correct, Eric?
That is correct, at The Right Take Pod.
Okay, and so now we're going to get into a bit of a different topic that might shock some of you. Guys, listen, we all know the Super Bowl is coming up, whether you're protesting the NFL or I was. Frankly, I just started watching. I stopped watching all seasonal games, and I stopped watching the NFL for years. I'm not going to lie to you. I got back into it after last year's playoffs a little bit, and now I watch football, even though I was trying to boycott them forever, and it didn't work. I'm sorry. I'm just being honest with you. But this latest thing, Eric, this that is taking the NFL by storm. Is this idea that Taylor Swift is Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift, she's going to come out, she's going to endorse, she's going to endorse Biden. Apparently that's going to make Biden win the election. All these people are getting all hot and bothered on it, even on the right. And this is insane. I don't give a flip. Everybody knows that Taylor Swift is a lefty. And frankly, I'm like, yeah, you know what? You kind of want drama at the Super Bowl and all the pomp and circumstance. I frankly don't care if she ends up showing up. But anyway, I wanted to get your take on this because you have a column coming up with some interesting takes on this very topic.
Basically, yeah, I say that this is got to be the granddaddy of right-wing conspiracies. This makes QAnon look sane. This makes the idea that Stanley Kubrick directed the moon landing footage look perfectly believable. The idea basically is that because, spoiler alert, Taylor Swift is really popular right now, guys. Yeah, she's at the peak of her popularity. She was Time Person of the Year. She had this movie, quote-unquote, which was just a recorded version of her concert, which did well at the box office. And now, yeah, she's in this romance with Travis Kelce, this football player I had never heard of before. And possibly he may pop the question on her after the Chiefs win the Super Bowl for a big fairy tale, love story, whatever. Some people unironically believe that their relationship has been set up by the deep state. Now, among other things, basically, what you're hearing, Taylor Swift is a deep state psyop, supposedly, that's going to swing the election for Biden, and there's nothing Trump can do to stop it. People point to a number of things. Travis Kelce was a spokesman for Pfizer. He did an infamous Pfizer ad promoting the vaccine, showing himself with the Band-Aids on his arm. Taylor Swift, yes, is a lefty. She's pro-BLM, pro-transgenderism, pro-feminism, all pro-abortion, everything, checks off all the boxes. And she's been endorsing political candidates for the last few years now. There's another theory also that ties into this, and this comes down to a handful of people. This originated on the right, a handful of colorful figures on the right, shall we say, who throw in everything. There's even a theory that George Soros basically owns her now and is forcing her to be left-wing because the Soros family, I guess, bought the rights to her music in 2019 or something like that. I don't know. But basically the theory is that she, with her massive following, as a celebrity, she's going to reach out to normies and non-voters and convince them to vote for Biden in droves in the tens of millions, and Trump's going to lose in a landslide. This is absolute garbage, and I could go down just a few examples in the past that people will cite of Taylor Swift supposedly being very popular. Now, of course, she first got involved in politics in 2018. She famously came out against then Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn, who was running for the Senate in Tennessee, and she endorsed Blackburn's Democratic opponent, Phil Bredesen. And as a result, Blackburn won by 11 points. She crushed Bredesen in a landslide. Now, some people will say, oh, well, Tennessee is known for delivering much larger margins of victory. Trump won it in 2020 over Biden by 23 points. But the polls, for the longest time, showed a tie, a very close election there, where maybe tied, Bredesen narrowly ahead, Blackburn ahead by a few points. She outperformed the polls. He underperformed. People attribute this to Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift's support alone made him nearly cross the finish line, even though he still missed by 11 points. Even though people don't take into account, he was a former two-term governor of Tennessee, popular and proven he had statewide appeal. He won his re-election with 60% of the vote, won every county. And he was also former mayor of Nashville. So this guy had name recognition. He had a record. He was not some nobody that Taylor Swift plucked up out of nowhere to endorse for this race. And, of course, it was 2018, which was a bad year for Republicans, a good year for Democrats. So many other factors factor in, and he still ultimately underperformed. So the idea of Taylor Swift almost swung that race is ridiculous. Then, of course, in 2020, she endorsed her first ever presidential ticket by endorsing Biden and Kamala. She, of course, had virtue signaled against Trump earlier in the year on what was then Twitter. And then she did a social media post in early October of 2020, encouraging her fans to register to vote, and even said, quote, request a ballot early and vote early. So you could argue she was even kind of in on the ballot harvesting stuff, telling her fans to vote early. But in the end, of course, as we all know, Trump still only barely quote-unquote, air quotes, lost the election. So whatever poll Swift may have had then had no impact. So the idea, and of course, especially in the aftermath of Dobbs, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, she's all in on pro-abortion, feminism, rallying. She did another appeal asking fans to vote and register to vote. And the New York Times crowed that, like, oh, in one day, her Instagram post caused a spike in voter registration with a total of 35,000 voters out of how many? 279 million, roughly, registered votes, which is approximately 0.000125%. So, I mean, the idea that, and that's scattered across the whole country all the way. That's not even concentrated in any of the swing states. So, among many other things, I'll detail this in more long form in the article when it comes out, but this idea, this absolute black pill doomer theory that Taylor Swift is going to single-handedly sweep Biden into a re-election landslide victory is just ludicrous. It's as crazy as the people who are promoting it. And if you really want to know who's promoting it, I don't want to name names here, Carl, if that's all right with you, unless you want me to name names. Otherwise, you can go to X and see for yourself the people who are promoting it, and you'll see why it's ludicrous.
All right, so the names that he mentioned, I won't ask you to name them, but the names that he mentioned are three names that popped up into my mind instantaneously. So I'm going to listen, it's his work. I want you to see his work at AM Greatness and also on X at The Right Pod. But Eric, I gotta tell you, man, I think this emboldens Taylor Swift. I think this is a dumb move by these people. I don't think listen, if she impacted, let's say 35,000 voters, like you said, okay, those 35 voters were lefties anyway. Maybe she empowered them or encouraged them to go to the polls or whatever. I don't think she has that type of pull. And honestly, I think that Republicans or conservatives or MAGA people, by doing this, just give her unnecessary power that she simply doesn't have. I'd like for entertainers to be entertainers. I like for football players to be football players. But even when they don't act like that, even when they act like political pundits, I think the best thing to do is kind of ignore them and say, you know what? I appreciate her singing ability. I appreciate her business acumen, her PR campaigns. Fabulous. She's great with her fans. I'm not taking any Taylor Swift advice on politics. Adios. And I feel like you leave it there.
Exactly. And to name names now, because there are plenty of people on the other side of this bashing this theory on X who are doing a great job of it. Of all people, Tim Pool called this out and tagged one of the promoters of this theory, basically saying because again, they're calling it a psyop, a psychic operation by the deep state. And he says the real psyop at anything is that these grifters on the right, they are on our side. We got to deal with that problem in our own house. These people are creating a problem by pitting MAGA against the Swifties. So if anything, it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy, which the mainstream media is already covering it now with mockery and laughing. Look at these idiot right-wingers in the Taylor Swift conspiracy theory. They are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, which could now inspire Taylor Swift to go after Trump. Because funny enough, Trump himself is not talking about this. Reports say that privately, he is brushing her off. He's dismissing her. Like, who cares what some singer says? I'm more popular than her. Exactly. He is taking the right stance. So, yeah, a handful of people who are sensibly acting on this, Tim Pool, John Doyle, MAGA originalists, some great accounts on X who are being calm and sensible, like pointing out, among other things, celebrities shilling for Democrats has been the standard for 60 years. All right, it's nothing new that the latest big one-hit wonder, who's just there's always some pop singer who's really popular, whether it's Katy Perry or Justin Bieber or whoever. And again, Katy Perry, she campaigned with Hillary multiple times, performed songs at her rallies. How'd that work out for her? So, no, we need to focus on the things that the things that matter most, which, as I said in my previous column, not the economy, but things like the cultural issues, transgenderism, CRT, the things that will get people onto our side, and not what some singer may or may not say.
Okay, so now here's something that's really important that I want people, I think this is a really important issue. We only have a minute and a half left, but I want you to touch on it. You have a column up at AM Greatness now, Eric, whistleblowers, Biden ATF drafting gun rule to ban private sales. This needs to be talked about. Americans need to know that the Biden administration is coming for your freedoms in every which way possible. Just brief us on this, a minute left.
According to the watchdog group Empower Oversight, which cited 2 whistleblowers at the ATF, apparently the proposal involves possibly forcing gun sales, gun stores and whatnot, people who sell firearms, to register as federally licensed gun dealers, which would thus be forced to undergo background checks and subsequently enter the information of all customers, everyone who purchases a firearm, into the FBI's NICS system. That's National Instant Criminal Background Check System. This is not surprising. We know Biden's been coming for our guns for a while now. He passed that big gun control bill after that one shooting in Texas, and they've been frustrated by the Supreme Court after the ruling, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which basically greatly expanded the right to concealed carry. This is another one that absolutely the Republicans should focus on. They are coming for our Second Amendment rights more brazenly than any Democrat in modern history.
Yeah, and this is so important. And guys, even if you're not a person that's, even if you don't like guns, understand the importance of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment exists to protect us against a tyrannical government. It's not to go hunting for your rabbits and deers and all that good stuff, even though it works for that. But ultimately, it's to protect us from a tyrannical government. Make sure you're paying attention. Eric Lindrum of AM Greatness, thank you so much for joining us. God bless you, man.